There was no seat for me at my own grandson's birthday party. I stood there for a moment, just inside the backyard gate, holding the neatly wrapped box I had picked out for him 3 days earlier, watching as children ran across the grass with balloons tied to their wrists and parents laughed beneath a white canopy strung with soft yellow lights. The table was long, set for at least 20 guests, with matching plates, folded napkins, and little name cards placed carefully in front of each chair. I scanned them once, then again, slower this time, as if my eyes might have missed something the first time. But they hadn't. My name wasn't there. Not misspelled. Not misplaced. Just gone. "Oh," a voice said lightly behind me, smooth and effortless. "Looks like we forgot you." I turned to see Vanessa standing there in a pale blue dress, her hair perfectly styled, her smile polite in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gave a small shrug, as if she were commenting on the weather. "We had to rearrange a few things last minute. You know how these parties go." I nodded slowly, as if that explanation made perfect sense, as if forgetting a grandmother at her own grandson's birthday was just another small hiccup in a busy day. "Of course," I said, my voice steady, almost pleasant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for a chair. I didn't ask why. I simply stepped a little further into the yard and stood near the edge of the table, placing the gift carefully on the corner where there was just enough space between a bowl of fruit and a stack of paper plates. No one stopped me. No one asked where I would sit. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to say anything. It's funny how silence can feel louder than any argument. I watched as my grandson, Ethan, ran past me, laughing, his small sneakers kicking up bits of grass. He didn't see me at first. He was too busy chasing another boy holding a bright red balloon. For a moment, I just stood there, taking in the scene. The decorations were beautiful. There was a large banner stretched across the fence with his name in bold letters, a 3-tier cake waiting on a separate table, and a rented bounce house humming softly in the background. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. Everything except me. "Mom," my son Daniel called from across the yard, raising a hand in greeting, his voice warm but distant, like he was acknowledging a neighbor rather than his own mother. "You made it." I smiled back. Wouldn't miss it. He didn't come over. He didn't ask if I'd eaten or if I needed anything. He simply turned back to the group he was standing with, already pulled into another conversation. I stayed where I was, hands loosely folded in front of me, as guests began taking their seats. Chairs scraped lightly against the ground. Laughter filled the air, and one by one, every place at that long table was taken. Every place except the one that didn't exist. I could have left. It would have been easy. I could have picked up my purse, walked back through the gate, and told myself I didn't need any of this. But I didn't leave. I stayed. I watched. Because something about the way Vanessa had said it, so casual, so practiced, told me this wasn't a mistake. And as I stood there, just outside the frame of every photo being taken, I realized something else too. This wasn't the first time I had been quietly moved aside. It was just the first time they had done it where everyone could see. I stayed through the cake cutting, through the singing, through the way everyone leaned in closer to each other, while I remained just a step outside their circle, like a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room, but had not yet been thrown away. I smiled when Ethan finally noticed me, his face lighting up as he ran over, wrapping his small arms around my waist for a quick hug before being called back by one of his friends. "Grandma, did you see the bounce house?" he asked breathlessly. "I did," I said, brushing a hand over his hair. "It looks like the best one I have ever seen." He grinned and ran off again before I could say anything more. That was the only moment all afternoon when I felt like I belonged there. When the cake was brought out, everyone gathered around the table. Candles flickered, cameras came out, and Vanessa positioned herself just slightly in front, guiding where people should stand, where they should look, who should move closer. I watched as she adjusted Ethan's shoulders, as she called Daniel to her side, as she waved in grandparents from her own family, placing them carefully within the frame. No one called my name. No one made space. I stood behind a group of guests I barely knew, close enough to hear the laughter, but too far to be included in the photograph. "Make sure everyone is in," Vanessa said, her voice bright, almost cheerful. The photographer nodded, scanning the group. His eyes passed over me for a second, uncertain, as if trying to decide whether I belonged in the picture or not. Vanessa did not look in my direction. "Perfect," she said. The flash went off. I was not in it. Later, as plates were cleared and children began tearing into their gifts, I drifted toward the gift table, more out of instinct than purpose. My box was still there, unopened, pushed slightly to the side to make room for larger packages wrapped in bright paper with oversized bows. I recognized some of the names on the tags. Vanessa's sister, Vanessa's parents, a few neighbors. Mine was the smallest gift on the table. I had chosen it carefully, something meaningful rather than expensive, something I thought Ethan would remember. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the box, then pulled my hand back as if I had touched something that did not belong to me anymore. You did not have to bring anything, you know, Vanessa said suddenly, appearing beside me again, her tone light, but her words carrying a quiet edge. We already took care of everything. I nodded, keeping my expression calm. I know, I said. I just wanted to. She gave a small smile, the kind that ended conversations rather than invited them. Well, that is very thoughtful. Thoughtful. The word lingered in the air for a moment before she turned away, already calling out instructions about cleanup and leftovers. I watched her move through the party like she owned every inch of it, every chair, every plate, every person. And maybe she did. Maybe that was the point. As the sun began to dip lower, casting longer shadows across the yard, guests started gathering their things. Chairs were folded, decorations were taken down, laughter softened into quiet goodbyes. I remained until the end, standing near the gate where I had first arrived, holding my purse a little tighter than necessary. Daniel walked me out, finally, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. Thanks for coming, Mom, he said. Ethan was really happy to see you. I smiled. I would not have missed it. He hesitated for a second, as if there was something else he might say, something that might fix what had been left unsaid all afternoon. But he did not. He simply nodded and stepped back, already turning toward the house where Vanessa's voice was calling his name. I walked to my car alone, the sound of the party fading behind me. As I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, I thought about the empty space at that table, about the way it had not been an accident, not really. Everything about that day had been planned. Every detail had been considered, including the part where I did not belong. And for the first time, I did not feel confused. I felt certain. The drive home was quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence, the kind that settles into your chest and stays there long after the engine turns off. And I remember sitting in my driveway for several minutes, watching the porch light flicker against the front window of my house, thinking about how different it used to feel to come home after family gatherings, how there had once been laughter that lingered, stories I would replay in my mind, little moments that made everything feel connected. But that night there was nothing to replay except the absence of something that should have been there all along. And as I stepped inside, the house greeted me the way it always did, quiet, familiar, untouched, exactly as I had left it, which somehow made the contrast sharper, because just an hour earlier I had been surrounded by people who were supposed to be mine, yet I had felt more alone there than I did standing in my own kitchen now. And I set my purse down on the counter, taking a slow breath as I looked around at the small details I had built over the years, the framed photos, the neatly arranged dishes, the soft hum of the refrigerator, all of it steady and unchanged, unlike everything else. And without really planning to, I found myself walking toward the living room where a photograph sat on the shelf, one taken nearly 10 years ago, back when Ethan was just a toddler and Daniel still came by every Sunday, without needing to be reminded, back before Vanessa had learned how to arrange things the way she wanted them. And in that picture I was standing right in the center, holding Ethan in my arms while Daniel stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and there had been no question then about where I belonged, no careful positioning, no silent exclusions, just a simple understanding that family meant something solid, something that did not shift depending on who was organizing the seating chart, and I reached out to touch the edge of the frame, my fingers lingering there as I tried to pinpoint when exactly that feeling had started to change, because the truth was, it had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, almost invisible at first, small things that were easy to excuse, easy to overlook, like the time Vanessa had moved a dinner to a different day and forgotten to tell me until it was too late, or when group messages started arriving without including my number, explained away as simple mistakes, harmless oversights, things that anyone could do. And I had believed that, because it was easier than believing something else, easier than admitting that those Small moments were not accidents at all, but pieces of a pattern that had been forming quietly in the background, one decision at a time, one omission after another, until eventually it led to something as clear and undeniable as an empty space at a table that had been carefully arranged for everyone except me. And as I stood there in my living room, looking at that old photograph, I realized that what had happened that afternoon was not new. It was simply the first time it had been impossible to ignore, the first time the message had been delivered without any attempt to soften it. And I thought about Vanessa's voice, the way she had said it so casually, as if forgetting me was not something that required apology or explanation, as if it was simply the natural order of things. And for a long time, I had adjusted myself to fit into that order, making myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, telling myself that it was temporary, that things would settle, that relationships changed over time, and that was just part of life. But sitting there now, with the house wrapped in stillness around me, I could no longer pretend that this was something passing or accidental, because patterns do not build themselves without intention, and people do not disappear from tables by chance. And for the first time in years, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong and started asking a different question entirely, one that felt colder but somehow clearer. And that question stayed with me as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, echoing quietly in the back of my mind, not as doubt, but as something else entirely, something steady and certain, something that no longer needed to be answered out loud. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already started sorting through things I had ignored for far too long. And as I stood in my kitchen making coffee, I found myself replaying moments that once felt insignificant, moments that I had brushed aside with a quiet smile or a simple excuse, telling myself that families change, that dynamics shift, that it was not worth making a fuss over small things. But now those small things were lining up in a way that felt impossible to dismiss. And I remembered a Sunday dinner from nearly a year ago when Vanessa had suggested we eat earlier than usual, saying it would be easier for Ethan's schedule, and I had arrived right on time, only to find that everyone had already finished eating, plates cleared, conversation winding down, and she had apologized lightly, saying they must have gotten the time mixed up, and I had believed her because I wanted to, because the alternative felt too uncomfortable to consider. And then there was the Christmas gathering where she insisted on hosting, taking control of every detail, every dish, every invitation, and I had been told it would be a small, quiet evening, nothing elaborate, just immediate family. And I had spent that night alone in this same house, heating leftovers and watching the clock, only to see photos the next day of a full dining table, guests I recognized, laughter captured in perfect frames that I had not been part of. And even then I had said nothing, convincing myself there must have been a misunderstanding, that perhaps plans had changed at the last minute, that it was not personal. But now, standing there with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, I could see it clearly for what it was, a pattern built not on accidents, but on decisions, quiet, deliberate decisions made again and again until they became something solid, something undeniable. And I set the cup down slowly, my fingers resting against the counter as another memory surfaced, one I had almost forgotten, from the summer before last when Ethan had his first school performance, and I had asked Vanessa what time it started, asking more than once just to be sure, and she had told me it was early, much earlier than usual, almost too early for me to make it comfortably. And I had still tried, leaving my house before sunrise, only to arrive and find that the auditorium was already empty, chairs stacked, lights dimmed, and a teacher explaining gently that the event had ended nearly an hour earlier. And I had stood there in that empty room, holding a small bouquet I had brought for Ethan, feeling something I could not quite name at the time, something that felt too heavy for such a simple mistake. And now I understood why, because it had never been a mistake at all, and the realization did not come with anger the way I might have expected. It came with a kind of quiet clarity, the kind that settles in slowly and leaves no room for doubt. And I moved to the window, looking out at the street as the morning lights spread across the pavement, thinking about how many times I had adjusted myself to fit into situations that were quietly pushing me out, how often I had chosen comfort over truth, silence over confrontation, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of that, not as regret, but as understanding, because it is one thing to be overlooked once, maybe twice. But it is something else entirely when it happens so consistently that it begins to reshape your place in a family without ever being spoken aloud. And I thought about Vanessa again, about the way she moved through every gathering with such ease, such control, always smiling, always polite, never openly unkind, but always managing to shift things just enough, just subtly enough, that I would find myself on the outside, looking in. And the truth was, she had never needed to say anything harsh or cruel, because what she was doing did not require words. It required planning, timing, and the quiet confidence that no one would question it. And for a long time, no one had, including me. But something had changed now, something small but important, because for the first time, I was no longer trying to explain it away. I was no longer searching for reasons that would make it less intentional, less personal. And as I stood there, watching the world move outside my window, I realized that understanding a pattern is the first step in breaking it. And that thought did not feel heavy. It felt steady, like something I could finally hold on to without it slipping through my fingers. By late morning, I found myself pulling out an old folder from the cabinet in my study, one I had not opened in years, not because I had forgotten about it, but because I had never needed to. And as I sat down at the table and flipped it open, the papers inside felt heavier than I remembered, each page holding a piece of a life I had quietly built long before anyone thought to rearrange my place in it. And I started with something simple, a receipt from a few months ago, the payment I had made for Ethan's birthday party, the same party where I had stood without a chair. And I remembered how Vanessa had called me weeks earlier, her voice warm, almost affectionate, explaining how expensive everything had become, how she wanted to make the day special for Ethan but needed a little help. And I had agreed without hesitation, because that is what you do when it comes to your grandchildren. You do not calculate. You do not question. You simply give. And I had written the check myself, mailed it the same day, never mentioning it again, never expecting anything in return, not even acknowledgement. And now, looking at that receipt, I realized something I had not allowed myself to see before, that I had not just been present in their lives, I had been supporting them in ways that were quietly essential. And that thought led me to another document, one from the previous year, a transfer for Ethan's school tuition assistance. Something Daniel had mentioned casually over dinner, saying things were a bit tight at the time, and I had stepped in without making it a conversation, because I remembered what it felt like to struggle, to want to give your child more than you could afford, and I had wanted to make things easier for them, not knowing that while I was doing that, something else was happening in the background, something that was slowly redefining my place in their world. And I leaned back in my chair, letting the papers rest in my lap as another realization settled in. Not sharp, not sudden, but steady and clear, because it was not just about the money. It was about the pattern of giving without presence, of contributing without being acknowledged, of being useful but not included. And I thought about the way Vanessa had spoken to me at the party, the way she had dismissed the absence of a seat as if it were nothing. And it struck me then that she had grown comfortable with that dynamic, comfortable with the idea that I would continue to show up, continue to support, continue to accept whatever space I was given, no matter how small, because that is what I had always done. And I stood up slowly, gathering the papers back into the folder, but this time I did not slide it back into the cabinet. I kept it in my hands, holding it with a kind of quiet certainty that felt new, because for the first time, I was not looking at these documents as memories or records. I was seeing them as something else entirely, something that carried weight, something that mattered. And as I walked toward the window again, the same place I had stood earlier that morning, I realized that the balance I had accepted for so long was not as fixed as I once believed, that the roles we play in a family are not always as permanent as they seem, especially when they are built on assumptions that no longer hold true. And I did not feel anger as I stood there. I did not feel the urge to confront or accuse. What I felt instead was a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the moment when you stop waiting for something to change and begin to understand that you have the ability to change it yourself. And that thought did not come with noise or urgency. It came quietly, settling in a place the same way everything else had, except this time, it was not something I would ignore, because now I could see the pattern clearly, and more importantly, I could see where it led. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not standing outside of it. I was standing at the point where it could finally be broken. That afternoon, I made a phone call I had not made in years, not because I did not know who to call, but because I had never needed to before, and when the receptionist answered, her voice polite and professional, I gave my name and waited, listening to the quiet click as the line transferred, feeling something settle inside me that was not hesitation, but focus. And when he picked up, his voice older but still familiar, I introduced myself again, even though I knew he would remember, because some names do not disappear entirely. They just become quieter over time. Evelyn Carter, I said, and there was a brief pause before recognition returned, warm and certain, and within minutes, we had arranged a meeting for the next morning, simple, straightforward, no explanations needed over the phone. And when I hung up, I did not feel nervous. I felt prepared, because for the first time, I was not reacting to something that had already happened. I was stepping ahead of it, and the next day, I arrived at his office 10 minutes early, sitting in a chair by the window as I watched people move along the sidewalk below, each of them carrying their own concerns, their own quiet decisions. And when he finally stepped into the room, greeting me with a firm handshake and a thoughtful look, I could tell immediately that he understood something had changed, not because I said it, but because it showed in the way I carried myself, the way I placed the folder on the table between us, opening it slowly, deliberately, and as we went through the documents together, page by page, I did not rush, I did not skip over details. I let everything be seen clearly, every contribution, every transfer, every decision I had made over the years without ever asking for anything in return, and he listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a question that helped sharpen the picture even further, until finally he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as he looked at me with a level of attention that felt both professional and personal. And when he spoke, his words were measured, precise, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just factual. You have more control here than you seem to think, he said. And I did not respond right away, not because I was surprised, but because I was letting the weight of that statement settle into place. Because control is not something you notice when you are not using it. It is something that becomes visible only when you begin to look at it differently. And as he continued explaining, outlining options, clarifying structures that had been set in place years ago, I realized that the balance I had accepted for so long had never actually been equal. It had simply gone unquestioned, and that difference mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to consider. And when the meeting ended, I did not leave with anger or urgency. I left with something far more useful, clarity, the kind that does not demand immediate action, but quietly prepares you for the moment when action becomes necessary. And as I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the world did not look different, but I did, because I was no longer standing on the outside of something I did not understand. I was standing inside a situation I could finally see in full, and as I walked to my car, I thought again about that empty space at the table, about how deliberate it had been, how carefully it had been arranged, and for the first time, I did not see it as something that had been taken from me. I saw it as something that had revealed exactly what I needed to know, and that realization did not make me feel smaller. It made me feel steady, because once you understand the structure of something, you also understand how easily it can change. And as I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I did not think about what I had lost. I thought about what I now knew, and more importantly, what I was finally ready to do with it. Over the next few days, I did not call Daniel, and I did not wait for him to call me either, which in itself was a change I felt more than I expected, because for years I had been the one to reach out first, to check in, to maintain the thread that kept everything connected. But now I let the silence remain exactly as it was, not out of resentment, but out of clarity, because I wanted to see what would happen when I stopped holding things together on my own. And at first, nothing happened at all. The days passed quietly. The phone stayed still, and I went about my routine without interruption, making breakfast, tending to the small garden in my backyard, organizing things around the house that I had been putting off for months. And in that quiet, I began to notice something I had not paid attention to before, how much of my time and energy had been directed outward, toward people who had gradually made less and less space for me, and how little I had allowed myself to step back and look at things as they truly were. And one afternoon, as I was sorting through a drawer in my study, I came across a set of spare keys, neatly labeled, one for Daniel's house, one for the old office space that no longer existed, and one for a storage unit I had not visited in years. and I held the house key for a moment longer than the others, turning it slightly between my fingers as I thought about how often I used to let myself in without knocking, how natural it had once felt to walk through that door, to hear Ethan's voice from the living room, to smell whatever Vanessa was cooking in the kitchen, to belong without needing permission, and now, even the idea of using that key felt out of place, like something from a version of my life that no longer existed, and I set it down carefully, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, because keys only matter when doors are meant to be opened, and some doors, I was beginning to understand, had already been closed in ways that did not require locks. And later that evening, my phone finally rang, Daniel's name appearing on the screen after several days of silence, and I let it ring. Once, twice, before answering, not to make a point, but because I no longer felt the urgency I once did, and when I picked up, his voice sounded casual, almost unaware. "Hey, Mom, just checking in," he said, and I listened to the way he spoke, the ease in his tone, the absence of anything that might acknowledge what had happened at the party. And I responded the same way I always had, calm, steady, asking about his week, about work, about Ethan, and for a moment, it almost felt normal, like we were following a script we both knew too well, until he said something that shifted the conversation just slightly. "Vanessa is planning another get-together next weekend," he said. "Just something small, nothing big." And I paused, not long enough for him to notice, but long enough for me to consider the weight of that invitation, or rather, the way it was presented, not as a request, not as something that included me directly, but as information, something I could choose to respond to or not. And I realized then that this was where things used to repeat, where I would say yes without thinking, where I would show up and adjust myself to whatever space was left for me. But this time, I did not answer right away, and in that small pause, something shifted again, something subtle but important, because for the first time, I was not reacting out of habit, I was choosing deliberately, and when I finally spoke, my voice was the same as always, calm and even. "That sounds nice," I said, and I let the sentence end there, without offering more, without filling the silence the way I used to, and Daniel hesitated, just for a second, as if he had expected something else, something more familiar, but I did not add anything further, and after a brief exchange about unrelated things, the call ended the way it always did, simple, uneventful, but when I set the phone down, I knew that something had changed, not in him, not in Vanessa, but in me, because I was no longer stepping automatically into the role they had quietly assigned me. And as I sat there in the quiet of my living room, I realized that change does not always arrive with confrontation or dramatic words. Sometimes it begins in the smallest decisions, the pauses, the things you choose not to say, and the spaces you no longer rush to fill. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was no longer standing where they had placed me. I was beginning to choose where I stood. The rest of that week moved with a kind of quiet precision I had not experienced in a long time. Not because anything dramatic was happening on the surface, but because I had started to make decisions that no one else could see. And for once, I did not feel the need to explain them to anyone, not even to myself. And each morning I sat at the same table with the same folder in front of me, going through it slowly, carefully, not searching for something new, but understanding more clearly what had always been there. And with each page, each document, each record of something I had given or supported or quietly sustained, the picture became sharper, more defined, until there was no space left for doubt or second-guessing. And by Thursday afternoon, I made another call, this time shorter, more direct, confirming details that did not require discussion, only execution. And when I hung up, I felt the same steady calm I had felt before, the kind that does not come from emotion, but from certainty. And later that evening, I received a message from Vanessa, something I had not expected, not because she never reached out, but because the tone was different, lighter than usual, almost performative in its warmth, reminding me about the small gathering Daniel had mentioned, adding that it would be nice to have everyone together again. And I read the message once, then set my phone down without responding right away, letting the words sit exactly where they were, because for the first time, I could see them clearly, not just what they said, but what they did not say. There was no acknowledgement of the last gathering, no reference to the space that had been left empty, no attempt to bridge what had been quietly broken. Just an expectation, subtle but firm, that things would continue as they always had, that I would step back into place without question, without hesitation, and I found that I no longer felt the pull to do that, not out of resistance, but out of understanding, because once you see a pattern, you cannot return to the version of yourself that accepted it without question, and I waited until the next morning before replying, keeping my message simple, measured, and entirely my own. I will let you know, I wrote. Nothing more, nothing less, and when I pressed send, I noticed something I had not expected. There was no lingering thought, no second guessing, no need to soften the edges of what I had said. It was enough, and over the next couple of days, I continued with my routine, but everything felt slightly different, not in appearance, but in meaning. The same rooms, the same objects, the same quiet afternoons, all of it unchanged, and yet I was no longer moving through it the same way, because there was a shift beneath it, something steady and deliberate that had taken the place of the quiet compliance I had carried for so long. And on Saturday morning, I stood in front of my closet, looking at the rows of neatly hung clothes, choosing what to wear for the gathering I had not yet confirmed. And for a moment, I considered not going at all, considered stepping entirely out of the situation and letting things settle on their own. But that thought passed quickly, not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer necessary, because this time, I was not going to stand outside anything. I was not going to leave space for someone else to define where I belonged. And as I reached for a simple, well-fitted dress, one I had not worn in quite some time, I realized that this was not about attending another gathering. It was about something else entirely, something quieter but far more significant. And as I adjusted the sleeve and looked at my reflection, I did not see someone waiting to be included. I saw someone who understood exactly what she was stepping into, and more importantly, exactly what she was no longer willing to accept. And that understanding did not feel heavy. It felt steady, like the beginning of something that had already been set in motion, something that did not need to be announced, only carried through to its natural conclusion. When I arrived, the house looked almost identical to the last gathering. The same carefully arranged chairs, the same soft music playing in the background, the same effortless atmosphere Vanessa always seemed to create. And for a moment, it would have been easy to believe nothing had changed, that everything was exactly as it had always been. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something immediately, something small but unmistakable. There was a place set for me at the table, a chair pulled out slightly, a name card written neatly in black ink. Evelyn, placed between Daniel and Ethan, and I paused just long enough to take it in, not with surprise, but with quiet recognition, because this was not correction, it was adjustment, a response to something they had begun to sense without fully understanding. And Vanessa appeared moments later, her smile just as polished as before, her voice warm in a way that almost sounded rehearsed. "I am so glad you came," she said, stepping closer, her tone lighter than it had been the week before. And I returned the smile, matching her tone without adding anything to it, because there was no need to rush ahead of what was unfolding. And as guests began to arrive, I moved through the room calmly, greeting people, taking my seat when it was time, not hesitating, not questioning, simply occupying the space that had been set for me as if it had always been mine. And for the first time in a long while, no one looked surprised to see me there, not because they had suddenly changed, but because I had, and that difference shaped everything that followed. And during dinner, conversations flowed easily, laughter moved from one end of the table to the other, and I listened more than I spoke, observing the small shifts in behavior, the way Vanessa glanced in my direction more often than before, the way Daniel seemed slightly more attentive, as if aware of something he could not quite name, and I did not interrupt that awareness. I let it build on its own, because understanding does not need to be forced when it is already beginning to form. And at one point, Ethan leaned closer to me, his voice soft and familiar. "Grandma, are you staying for dessert this time?" he asked, and I met his eyes, steady and calm. "Yes," I said, "I am staying." And he smiled, satisfied, returning to his plate, and I realized then that for him, nothing had changed. I was still exactly who I had always been, and that mattered more than anything else in that room. And as the evening continued, Vanessa stood to make a brief announcement about an upcoming family trip, outlining plans, mentioning details, and as she spoke, I noticed the way she included my name. This time, casually, naturally, as if it had always been part of the arrangement, and I did not react, not outwardly, because inclusion offered after exclusion is not something you accept without understanding. It is something you observe, measure, and place exactly where it belongs. And when the conversation shifted again, I reached into my bag and placed a small envelope on the table beside my plate, not drawing attention to it, not announcing its presence, just setting it there quietly. And when Vanessa's eyes fell on it, there was a brief flicker of curiosity, followed by something else, something closer to uncertainty, and she asked, almost casually, "What is that?" And I looked at her for a moment before answering, my voice calm, even, unchanged. "Just something important," I said, and I left it at that, because not everything needs to be explained immediately. Not everything needs to be revealed all at once. And as the evening moved forward, I could feel the shift settling into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something that had already been decided long before this moment. And for the first time, I was not reacting to what they were doing. I was allowing them to respond to something they could not yet fully see. And as I sat there, surrounded by familiar faces, in a space that had once made me feel invisible, I realized that control does not always come from speaking louder or standing taller. Sometimes it comes from understanding exactly when to remain still, and when the time comes, exactly what to place on the table.